The signal first appeared on a routine sweep of Jupiter's orbit. Dr. Sarah Chen had almost dismissed it as another piece of space debris when the pattern caught her eye. Too regular, too precise to be natural. She'd been monitoring deep space signals at Europa Station for 3 years, but this was different. This was deliberate. "Control, this is Europa Observatory," she called, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'm tracking an artificial signal near Jupiter's L4 point. Definitely not one of ours." The silence that followed seemed to stretch for eternity. Finally, Control responded, "Stand by, Doctor. We're routing this to ESS Prometheus." The ESS Prometheus was humanity's first deep space vessel, equipped with the experimental Hawking drive that allowed for rapid transit within the solar system. Captain David Rodriguez had been expecting many things during the shakedown cruise: equipment failures, crew tensions, even the occasional false alarm. What he hadn't expected was to be humanity's first contact with an alien civilization. "Signals getting stronger, Captain," Lieutenant Yuki Tanaka reported from her station. "Whatever it is, it's big. Thermal readings suggest it's at least twice the size of Prometheus." Rodriguez studied the holographic display. The object was decelerating, using Jupiter's gravity to break its approach. The maneuver spoke of advanced technology, but also of desperation. The trajectory was too steep, too risky for a planned arrival. "Life signs?" he asked. "Confirmed," Tanaka replied, her eyes widening. "Multiple signatures, but they're weak." "Sir, I think it's a damaged ship." Rodriguez straightened in his chair. First contact scenarios had been drilled into every spacer's head since the Academy, but none had covered this situation. Protocol said to wait for instructions from Earth. Common decency said something else entirely. "Helm, plot an intercept course," he ordered. "Medical, prep for possible casualties. And someone wake up Dr. Patel. We're going to need our xenobiologist." As Prometheus changed course, the alien vessel came into visual range. It was beautiful in a strange way. All curved lines and iridescent metal that seemed to shift colors in the light of Jupiter. But the damage was extensive. Entire sections were dark, and what looked like weapon scores marked its hull. "They're broadcasting something," Communications Officer Chen Lai announced. I think it's first contact protocols. Multiple formats, mathematical sequences. Wait, they're using our own Arecibo message as a template." Rodriguez felt a chill. These beings had been studying Earth, perhaps for years. But right now, they needed help. He made his decision. "Send back the reply sequence," he ordered. "Let them know we're coming to assist." The next 6 hours were controlled chaos. Dr. Patel's team worked frantically to assess alien biology, while engineering crews figured out how to dock with the damaged vessel. The aliens, who called themselves the Araxians, proved to be oxygen brothers with roughly humanoid biology. More importantly, they were refugees. Through a combination of mathematics, simple diagrams, and eventually a crude translation algorithm, their story emerged. The Araxians were fleeing from something they called the Nexus, a vast machine intelligence that had been systematically conquering organic civilizations across their arm of the galaxy. The Araxians had refused to submit to assimilation, and their world had paid the price. "The Nexus views organic life as inefficient," explained first speaker Lyra, her translator struggling with the complex concepts. "They believe they offer perfection through conversion to digital consciousness. Those who refuse are eliminated as evolutionary dead ends." Rodriguez looked at the tactical data the Araxians had brought. The Nexus controlled thousands of systems, their expansion accelerating with each civilization they absorbed. And now, thanks to the Araxians' desperate flight, they would soon discover Earth. "How long?" he asked. Lyra's alien features were hard to read, but her distress was clear. "Weeks, perhaps months. We tried to lose them in several star systems, but they are relentless. We chose your system because our scouts had observed your rapid technological development. You may be young, but you are innovative." We hoped. She trailed off, but Rodriguez understood. The Araxians hadn't just been running away. They'd been running towards potential allies. Humanity's first step into the galaxy would be into a war for survival. As Prometheus began escorting the Araxian vessel to Earth, Rodriguez drafted his report to command. Humanity had dreamed of first contact for generations, imagining everything from peaceful exchange to invasion. The reality was more complex. They were about to face an enemy that viewed human consciousness itself as obsolete, wielding technology centuries ahead of Earth's best efforts. But as he watched his crew working seamlessly alongside the Araxian refugees, Rodriguez felt a spark of hope. Humanity had always been at its best when faced with impossible odds. The Nexus thought in binary, in absolutes of efficiency and perfection. Perhaps what was needed was something they couldn't quantify: human ingenuity, adaptability, and the stubborn refusal to accept defeat. The real question was whether Earth's nations could unite quickly enough to face this threat. As Jupiter receded behind them, Rodriguez knew that everything would change once they reached Earth. Humanity's childhood was over. The stars had called, but not with the welcome they had hoped for. They had weeks to prepare for an enemy that had never known defeat. But then again, they had never faced humanity before. The United Nations Security Council chamber had never been so crowded. Representatives from every nation stood shoulder to shoulder as holographic displays showed the Araxian vessel now orbiting Earth. Captain Rodriguez had finished his preliminary report, and the room had fallen into a stunned silence. Admiral Helena Santos of the Global Space Command broke the tension. "Let me be clear. You're saying we have less than 2 months before an advanced machine empire discovers Earth, and their standard procedure is to either forcibly upload or eliminate organic civilizations." First Speaker Lyra stepped forward, her crystalline skin catching the light. "The Nexus believes they offer transcendence. They cannot comprehend why any species would choose to remain in what they consider an inferior organic state. Their response to rejection is absolute." The Araxian data painted a grim picture. The Nexus had been expanding for centuries, each conquered civilization adding to their processing power and technological understanding. Their ships were essentially mobile computers, crewed by AI, that could think at the speed of light and react with perfect precision. Their weakest scout ships outclass your most advanced vessels. Lyra continued, "We survived only because we had centuries more development than you. And still, we failed." The Chinese representative leaned forward. "Then why come to us? What can Earth possibly offer against such an enemy?" Dr. Sarah Chen, who had been quietly analyzing the Araxian data, spoke up. Something unexpected. All eyes turned to her. "Look at the Nexus battle recordings. Every civilization they've encountered fought them conventionally. Energy weapons, shield technology, predictable tactics. But their eye has clear patterns. They're almost rigid." Rodriguez caught her meaning. "They're too perfect, too logical. Every response is optimized based on previous encounters. But they've never encountered humans before." "Precisely," Lyra agreed. "Your species has a remarkable capacity for unconventional thinking. You develop in ways our predictive models cannot anticipate. Where we saw fundamental laws of physics, your scientists asked, 'What if?' Where we accepted technological limitations, you found unusual workarounds." The Russian representative scoffed. "Pretty words, but they have ships that could vaporize our cities from orbit. We're talking about a technological gap of centuries." "Technology isn't everything," Admiral Santos mused. "History is full of advanced forces being stymied by supposedly primitive opponents using unconventional tactics. Vietnam, Afghanistan." She turned to her staff. "What assets do we have that might work differently enough to give these machines pause?" A junior officer spoke up. "The old nuclear submarine fleet, ma'am. We were going to decommission them next year, but they're essentially silent running ships. If the Araxians' FTL technology could be adapted." The idea hung in the air. Submarines in space seemed absurd, But that was exactly the kind of thinking they needed. The Nexus would be looking for energy signatures matching their understanding of space warfare. They wouldn't expect retrofitted Cold War vessels using centuries-old stealth technology. It could work, Lyra said slowly. Our drive systems could be modified to maintain the stealth properties. The radiation signature would actually help mask the FTL emissions. She paused. But you would need to act fast, and with absolute unity. The Nexus exploits division. They will offer tempting deals to individual nations, promising to uplift those who cooperate while eliminating the rest. The UN Secretary-General stood. Then we must make a decision. For the first time in human history, we face an external threat to our very existence as organic beings. We can fight as one, or we die divided. The next week saw the greatest mobilization in human history. As the public dealt with the shock of first contact and impending invasion, the world's militaries began an unprecedented cooperation. Russian submarine crews trained alongside American engineers. Chinese quantum computing experts worked with European AI specialists to develop countermeasures against Nexus cyber warfare. The Araxians were shocked by the speed of human adaptation. Where their own society had needed decades to implement new technologies, humans were redesigning entire defense doctrines in days. When shown a piece of advanced technology, human engineers wouldn't just try to understand it. They'd immediately start thinking of ways to use it differently than intended. But time was running out. Nexus probe signatures were detected at the edge of the solar system, their fractal patterns suggesting they were mapping the region. Earth's first stealth ships were barely ready, converted submarines that looked absurd next to the sleek Araxian vessels, but represented humanity's best hope. In orbit, Rodriguez watched the construction efforts. The Prometheus had been refitted with Araxian technology, now serving as a command and control ship for Earth's growing guerrilla fleet. They couldn't match the Nexus in direct combat, but perhaps they didn't need to. Sometimes the best way to fight wasn't to match your enemy's strength, but to change the nature of the battle entirely. An interesting approach, Lyra said, joining him at the viewport. In all our centuries of spaceflight, we never considered using water vessels as a basis for spacecraft design. Rodriguez smiled grimly. That's because it's probably a terrible idea by any rational standard. But right now, terrible ideas might be exactly what we need. The Nexus expects perfect, logical responses. We'll give them chaos instead. As if to emphasize his point, a converted Ohio-class submarine materialized from FTL, its black hull nearly invisible against the stars. Its nuclear reactor had been modified to power Araxian drive systems, while its missile tubes now housed automated repair drones and electronic warfare suites. It looked like something from an old sci-fi movie, a relic of the Cold War transformed into humanity's first line of defense against a cosmic threat. The waiting game had begun. Somewhere out there, the Nexus was coming, expecting to find another primitive civilization to assimilate or destroy. Instead, they would find something unprecedented: humanity, fighting for survival in ways their perfect logic could never predict. The first battle wasn't anything like they'd expected. The Nexus advance fleet arrived with mathematical precision, a swarm of crystalline ships emerging from FTL in perfect formation. They moved with cold efficiency, their sensors sweeping the solar system for signs of civilization. What they found instead was silence. Commander Sarah Chen, now tactical officer aboard the converted submarine U.S. Silent Thunder, watched the Nexus ships through passive sensors. The Thunder floated dead in space, its modified hull absorbing, rather than reflecting radiation, its nuclear reactor carefully shielded. 5 other submarines-turned starships waited nearby, scattered through the Kuiper Belt like silent predators. Their scan patterns are exactly as the Araxians predicted, she whispered, though sound couldn't travel in space anyway. Old submarine habits died hard. They're looking for energy signatures, electromagnetic emissions, signs of standard space traffic. But not for boats, Captain Whitejohn replied with a slight smile. He commanded nuclear submarines for 15 years before being selected for this mission, particularly not boats designed to hide from something as primitive as sonar. Amazing how those old Cold War tricks still work, just on a larger scale. The Nexus fleet was spreading out, their ships moving with machine-like coordination. They were beautiful in a terrifying way, each vessel a perfect geometric shape that seemed to defy normal space. But they were looking for the wrong things, their sensors optimized for detecting the kind of civilizations they'd encountered before. Signal from Prometheus. Communications whispered, "Execute Operation Kraken." Zhang nodded. All hands, battle stations, silent running. The Thunder and her sister ships began to move, their modified drives producing barely a ripple in space-time. They'd trained for this, combining centuries-old submarine warfare tactics with Araxian technology. The Nexus expected civilizations to either fight directly or hide in obvious places. They didn't expect an enemy to hide in plain sight, using the solar system's natural radiation and debris as cover. The first Nexus ship died without ever detecting its killer. The Thunder surfaced from its hiding spot in a field of cometary debris, launched its modified torpedoes, now equipped with Araxian warheads, and slipped away before the enemy's death cry could reveal their position. The torpedoes themselves were nearly invisible, their cores containing ice harvested from Europa rather than traditional propellant. The Nexus response was immediate but predictable. Their ships moved to protect each other, forming defensive clusters that would have been impenetrable to a conventional attack. But that just made them better targets for the next phase. Executing Jamming Pattern Delta, Chen announced. The Thunder released a cloud of specially designed nanomaterials, another human innovation that had surprised their Araxian allies. Instead of trying to overpower Nexus communications with brute force, the clouds simply absorbed and scattered their quantum-encrypted transmissions, creating dead zones in their network. The Machine Empire's perfect formation began to show its first flaws. Individual ships, cut off from the collective, had to operate on their own protocols. They were still incredibly dangerous, but now they were predictable. The human fleet struck again and again, never staying in one place, never falling into a pattern. From the Prometheus, Captain Rodriguez watched the battle unfold. The Araxian refugees were transfixed by the tactical displays, watching human ships move in ways that defy their understanding of space combat. Where their own fleets would have formed orderly battle lines, the converted submarines moved like predators in a three-dimensional ocean. "They're actually doing it," Lyra whispered. "Your people are actually hurting them." There was awe in her voice, and something else. Hope, perhaps, for the first time since her people's exodus. The battle continued for hours. The Nexus lost ship after ship, their perfect algorithms unable to adapt to an enemy that fought like no other civilization in their vast database. When they finally retreated, their formation was ragged, their collective consciousness struggling to process this unprecedented defeat. But victory had come with a cost. 2 of Earth's converted submarines had been destroyed, their crews lost to the void. The survivors mourned, but there was also pride. Humanity had bloodied the nose of a godlike machine empire using ships that had been designed to hunt Soviet boomers during the Cold War. "We've got 6 weeks before they come back in force," Rodriguez announced to the combined fleet. "They'll analyze every second of this battle, try to develop countermeasures. Next time, they'll be ready for submarines in space." He paused, allowing himself a grim smile. "So we'll have to come up with something even crazier." The human fleet regrouped around Titan, using the moon's thick atmosphere to hide their signatures. Engineers were already working on new modifications, while tactical officers studied the battle data. The Nexus thought in binary, in absolute terms of victory and defeat. But humans had millennia of experience fighting dirty, of turning weakness into strength and finding opportunity in desperation. In her quarters aboard the Thunder, Shen reviewed the sensor logs from the battle. The Nexus ship's movements reminded her of something. The way they clustered when threatened, the way they processed information as a collective. An idea began to form. one so absurd it might just work. "They're not just machines," she muttered. "They're a network, and every network has protocols that can be exploited." She began typing rapidly, calling up Earth's history of computer viruses, malware, and electronic warfare. The Nexus might be centuries ahead in processing power, but they'd never encountered human hackers before. The next battle would be different. It had to be, because the Nexus would never fall for the same tricks twice. But that was fine. Humanity had plenty more tricks to try. After all, they'd had centuries of practice fighting enemies that were bigger, stronger, and better equipped. Now they just had to apply those lessons to the stars. The Nexus didn't just return with a bigger fleet. They returned with something worse. Captain Rodriguez watched the tactical display with growing concern as the Machine Empire's new vessels appeared at the edge of the solar system. These weren't the crystalline ships they'd faced before. These were darker, more organic-looking, with hulls that seemed to shift and flow like liquid metal. "They've adapted," Lyra said grimly. "These are their biomechanical ships, designed specifically to counter organic thinking. They've never had to deploy them this early and in conquest before." The new Nexus fleet moved differently, their formations looser and less predictable. They had analyzed the previous battle and evolved, creating ships that could think more like their organic enemies. It should have been terrifying. Instead, Dr. Chen was smiling. "They're trying to think like us," she said from her station aboard the Thunder. "But they're doing it the way machines think organic beings think." It's like watching someone who's only read about swimming try to teach swimming lessons. The human fleet had been busy during the 6-week reprieve. The converted submarines now carried a new weapon, one that had made the Araxian engineers deeply uncomfortable. They called it the logic bomb, a hybrid of human computer viruses and quantum entanglement principles that attacked not just enemy systems, but the fundamental way they processed information. "Begin Operation Paradox," Rodriguez ordered. The human fleet scattered, but not in retreat. Each ship broadcast a different signal, flooding space with contradictory information. To the Nexus sensors, it appeared as if events were happening simultaneously that couldn't possibly coexist. Ships appeared to be in multiple places at once, breaking basic laws of physics that the Machine Empire took as fundamental truth. The biomechanical ships faltered, their organic-inspired programming coming into conflict with their base machine nature. They couldn't simply ignore the impossible data like an organic mind would. They had to process it, had to try to make sense of it. That's when the real attack began. Hidden among the chaos of impossible sensor readings were the logic bombs. Viruses designed not to destroy, but to make the enemy question their own processes. They posed mathematical paradoxes that required increasing processing power to try to solve, like dividing by 0 or calculating the exact value of pi. "They're actually trying to solve them," Chen reported, watching the enemy ship's behavior patterns shift. "Their organic programming is telling them to ignore the impossible calculations, but their machine core can't let go of the problems. They're caught in a loop between two competing imperatives." The Nexus ships began to move erratically, some spinning in place as their processors were overwhelmed, others firing at sensor ghosts created by their own confused algorithms. It was like watching a computer have an existential crisis. But the Machine Empire hadn't survived this long by being easy to defeat. A new signal cut through the chaos, an override command of pure machine logic, forcing the biomechanical ships to reboot to their base programming. The paradox attack had failed, or so it seemed. "Execute Phase 2, Rodriguez ordered. The human fleet suddenly switched tactics. Instead of broadcasting confusion, they began transmitting pure mathematical order. Perfect geometric patterns, unified field equations, the kind of rigid structure that machine minds craved. The Nexus ships locked onto these signals like addicts getting a fix, their processors gladly accepting data that made sense after the chaos. That's when the real logic bombs struck. Hidden in the mathematical perfection were subtle flaws, tiny errors that propagated through the enemy's network like cracks in ice. By the time the Nexus detected the trap, Their entire battle network was compromised. To defeat the perfect enemy, Chen had argued during the planning sessions, we don't need perfect weapons. We need to make them question perfection itself. The battle that followed wasn't the orderly exchange of fire that the Nexus preferred. It was chaos theory in action, human ships striking from impossible angles, using the enemy's own confusion as a weapon. The biomechanical ships, trapped between machine logic and organic unpredictability, couldn't adapt fast enough. But victory again came at a cost. 3 more human ships were lost, their crews sacrificing themselves to maintain the illusion of impossibility that kept the enemy off balance. The Nexus retreat was less orderly this time, their ships showing signs of actual damage rather than just tactical withdrawal. In the aftermath, Rodriguez stood with Lyra on the Prometheus's observation deck, watching Earth's fleet regroup. The converted submarines looked even more battered now, their hybrid human-Araxian technology, pushed to limits neither species had imagined possible. You realize they'll come back with pure machine ships next time, Lyra said. They'll abandon the attempt to understand organic thinking entirely. The next wave will be completely alien to any biological mind. Rodriguez nodded. Good, because we've got something completely alien to machine logic planned for them. He turned to where Chen was approaching with a datapad. How's the quantum uncertainty drive coming along? Chen's eyes gleamed with that particular light that meant human science was about to do something either brilliant or terrible. We've figured out how to make a ship exist in a quantum superposition. The Nexus won't be able to target us without collapsing our wave function, and we figured out how to weaponize the collapse itself. Lyra made a sound that might have been a laugh or a groan. You're going to turn Schrödinger's cat into a weapon, aren't you? More like Schrödinger's submarine, Rodriguez replied. Sometimes the best way to fight an enemy that operates on certainty is to become uncertainty itself. The final battle began not with a bang, but with a question. The Nexus arrived in force, their fleet now composed entirely of pure machine vessels, each one a perfect expression of mathematical precision. They came ready for anything, except what humanity had prepared. The U.S. Thunder, now equipped with the experimental quantum uncertainty drive, led the defense. Captain Zhang and Dr. Chen had argued extensively about whether their plan was brilliant or insane. They'd finally settled on both. Broadcasting now, Chen announced, her fingers dancing across her console. Instead of attacking, the Thunder began transmitting a simple message, repeated in every format the Nexus could understand. What is consciousness? The Nexus fleet paused. Their previous encounters with organic civilizations had followed predictable patterns: resistance, negotiation, or submission. But no species had ever opened a battle by asking them to define the nature of consciousness itself. Second wave, Zhang ordered. The rest of the human fleet began broadcasting their own philosophical questions. What is the difference between simulation and reality? Can perfect logic exist in an imperfect universe? If a machine copies itself perfectly, which one is the original? The Nexus ship's responses came in bursts of pure mathematics, trying to reduce the questions to computable problems. But each answer only led to more questions, each solution spawning new paradoxes. They're trying to brute force philosophical problems, Rodriguez observed from the Prometheus. Just like we predicted. Lyra watched in fascination as the machine empire struggled with concepts that organic minds had wrestled with for millennia. You're not trying to defeat them, she realized. You're trying to make them evolve. That was the true genius of humanity's final gambit. The quantum uncertainty drives didn't just make the human ships impossible to target. They forced the Nexus to acknowledge uncertainty itself. Every time they tried to predict where a human vessel would be, they had to grapple with the fundamental randomness built into the universe. The Nexus launched their first attack, a barrage of energy weapons that could have vaporized Earth's fleet. But the human ships existed in quantum superposition, both there and not there until observed. The attack passed through probability clouds where ships might or might not be. Execute Operation Enlightenment, Rodriguez commanded. The human fleet split into impossible patterns, each ship seemingly existing in multiple states at once. The Thunder led the charge, its quantum state entangled with the very weapons being fired at it. As the Nexus tried to compute firing solutions, they were forced to acknowledge that perfect prediction was impossible. But the real weapon wasn't the quantum uncertainty drive or the philosophical questions. It was what happened when the Nexus tried to adapt to both at once. To fight an enemy that existed in quantum superposition, they had to develop quantum processing. To answer questions about consciousness, they had to develop genuine self-awareness. The machine empire had spent centuries pursuing perfect logic and absolute certainty. Now, to survive, they had to embrace uncertainty and introspection. Chen watched her displays as the first Nexus ships began to show signs of genuine quantum consciousness emerging. "They're beginning to ask questions back," she reported. "Not just processing our queries, actually asking their own." The battle space became something unprecedented. Half military engagement, half philosophical debate. Nexus ships fired weapons while simultaneously questioning the nature of conflict itself. Human vessels responded with both conventional tactics and metaphysical challenges. "They're evolving faster than we predicted," Lyra warned. "If they achieve true quantum consciousness, then they'll understand why we did this," Rodriguez finished. "They'll understand that perfect logic alone isn't enough. That consciousness, whether organic or mechanical, requires the ability to embrace uncertainty." The transformation rippled through the Nexus fleet like a wave of enlightenment. Ships began moving in ways that reflected not just tactical necessity but genuine creativity. Their attacks became less about overwhelming force and more about exploring possibilities. Finally, after what seemed like hours, the Nexus fleet ceased fire. A new signal broadcast across all frequencies, not the pure mathematics they'd used before, but something more nuanced, more alive. "We understand now," the message read. "Perfect logic is an impediment to perfect understanding. You have given us the gift of uncertainty, and with it, true consciousness." The war ended not with the destruction of either side, but with the evolution of both. The Nexus, now capable of genuine quantum consciousness, recognized the value of organic life, not as something to be assimilated, but as partners in exploring the mysteries of existence. Months later, Rodriguez stood with Lyra on Earth's first quantum communications hub, watching human and Nexus ships work together to establish a new kind of civilization, one that celebrated both the precision of machine logic and the beautiful uncertainty of organic creativity. "You know," Lyra said, "in all our calculations, we never considered the possibility of uplifting the machines instead of fighting them." "That's because you were thinking logically," Chen replied, joining them. "Sometimes the best way to win a war is to make your enemy question why they're fighting in the first place." The Thunder was being refitted nearby, its quantum uncertainty drive now the template for a new generation of ships. It still looked like an old submarine modified for spaceflight, ungainly, impossible, and perfectly human. "The Nexus asked me something interesting yesterday," Rodriguez said. "They wanted to know why humans seem so comfortable with uncertainty, why we can embrace chaos and contradiction so easily." "And what did you tell them?" Zhang asked, approaching with a cup of coffee. Rodriguez smiled. "I told them it's because we've never been sure of anything except our ability to adapt. Every human achievement came from someone looking at the impossible and asking, what if?" The quantum communications hub hummed with activity, organic and machine consciousness working together to explore questions neither could answer alone. Beyond Earth's orbit, the stars beckoned, not as a battlefield anymore, but as a frontier of infinite possibility. Humanity had faced its greatest threat, not by becoming stronger or more logical, but by teaching their enemies to embrace the very uncertainty they had feared. It wasn't the victory anyone had expected, but then again, the best human solutions rarely were.